Вітаю! Вже 3 тижні російська пропаганда.
Good afternoon. For 3 weeks now, Russian propaganda has been serving only one theme. This is an attempt to shift the responsibility for the terrorist attack that took place in Moscow onto Ukraine. All the forces of Russian propagandists, including the highest officials, have been devoted to this. In particular, Dmitry Medvedev, the former head of Russia, now Putin's deputy in the Russian Security Council, made a statement in which he tries to put responsibility on Ukraine. The true organizers are still hiding in the shadow of ISIS. There are officials of Nazi Ukraine, claims Medvedev, thus trying to justify the failure of Russia's own special services, as well as to justify further mobilization of its own population against Ukraine and to gain at least little sympathy from other countries. At the same time, he does not miss an opportunity to spit at the name and back of French President Emmanuel Macron, whom Medvedev has an extreme hatred for and uses increasingly low rhetoric for. Accomplices, they are different, and at least Macron is one of them. His rhetoric, his actions can be qualified as aiding and abetting a terrorist attack, which is why the oyster and champagne lover is so afraid that he had to publicly deny France's involvement in the attack, both by himself and through his subordinates. It is clear why there is such aggression against Macron, since he is openly pro-Ukrainian and willing to show Putin that there should be no red lines on the part of Europeans towards a terrorist state. Meanwhile, Russia's highest officials are broadcasting fake evidence on all possible platforms that Ukraine was supposed to be the endpoint for the terrorists who had committed the terrorist attack on Moscow. On the Russian state-run channel Russia Today, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who is also right to speak on behalf of Russia on global platforms, stated, "It is already obvious that the attack in the Crocus city hall could not do without the Ukrainian trace. Moreover, Ukraine's involvement in many other terrorist attacks is no longer in doubt." The Russian foreign minister stated so without citing any evidence. But this evidence was later provided by the investigative committee and Russian propagandists. According to RIA Novosti, the investigation has already received significant evidence that many indicate that the terrorists are connected to the Ukrainian special services. Then the official Russian propagandist courts published photos allegedly found in the phone one of the terrorists. The same photos are also published by Margarita Simonyan. What are these photos? These include, for example, a photo of a Ukrainian stamp that has been published, distributed around the world, and is even in some museums, including one at Stanford University. This is a stamp about a Russian warship. The photograph in the phone, which was allegedly found on the terrorist devices almost 3 weeks after the attack, is supposed to be evidence of Ukraine's involvement. Also, the Russian state-run Channel 1 Russia published a video of an interrogation conducted by the FSB, and these people who are accused of the terrorist attack are claiming that they fled towards Ukraine because they were supposed to have a curator waiting for them and $1 million reward for their actions. Foreign and Russian propagandists are further developing this fake version. Not a version, but simply propaganda nonsense on all platforms trying to attract Western audiences as well. Russia Today, a Russian propaganda state channel, claims Kyiv is openly saying that it has turned to terror, and CNN admits that it is doing so with the support of the West. Let's see who is the source of these studies. His name is war correspondent Thomas Tropper. The thought arises that perhaps this is a German journalist. In fact, he is a German propagandist who does not hide his sympathies for Putin. He reports from occupied Mariupol. He attends the broadcasts of Russian propagandist Solovyov. He rejected even the slightest possibility that Russia was involved in the terrorist attack on the Malaysian Boeing. This too has already been established by an international court. He further rejected Russia's involvement in the Skripal poisoning, although this was also established by the British investigation. He spreads Russian nonsense about how the genocide in Bucha was also a propaganda campaign by Ukraine and so on and so forth. There are many such propagandists, so be careful when you hear foreign names in the context of the nonsense coming from Russian officials. The same nonsense is being spread by these Western pseudo-journalists who are in fact just fake news makers. Next, Russia Today is trying to broadcast the idea that Russia started the war against Ukraine either in self-defense or that Russia was the victim of aggression. They quote a certain blogger, Nikolai Sobolev, who was suddenly removed from the list of foreign agents, and immediately on the air of a Russian propagandist channel, he claims that Russia is acting this way because it is an attempt to protect the perimeter, an attempt to protect people. Ukrainian nationalism has begun to spread, and therefore he says Russia has launched this armed aggression. This is an absolute lie, which there is no point in exposing. We can only repeat this, that all the that comes out of the mouths of Russian propagandists. There is another absolutely worthless fake created on a disposable website. It says that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky allegedly purchased a high-groove house estate which belonged to British King Charles III for £20 million. And this nonsense is published on a website that has existed for just a few weeks, which actually has no history of links in the past, and the article has no evidence. In general, it is just a template page created using a free website resource, and the Russian propagandists could not avoid the date, which they consider to be 10 years since the proclamation of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, but in fact this occupation of Donetsk region by the Russians. For example, propagandist Crocus has to admit in his publications that before the invasion there was nothing to bode ill for Donetsk. I remember Donetsk well in those days, a beautiful, well-groomed European metropolis with expensive shop windows, nightclubs and traffic jams, and bright street lights. Only the barricades disrupted the usual way of life, and few people believed that Ukraine would send its army to Donbass, and many hoped that Russia would annex the republic as it had done with Crimea. In other words, they admit that there were no problems in Donetsk before the invasion, but in fact they also admit that they were planning to annex the territory of Donetsk and that Ukraine was not supposed to put up any resistance. In other words, they admit that they were behind all these events in the Donetsk region from the very first day, which later resulted in a full-scale invasion. And the traditional theme in Russian propaganda resources is the alleged crisis of the legitimacy of the Ukrainian president, as well as the coup that is being planned either by the president himself or his opponents. The versions change depending on the methodology that is currently being developed. So Russia Today, the official resource for the aggressor state, quotes the traitor Tsarev. Zelensky is starting to have a legitimacy vacuum. Presidential elections were supposed to be held in Ukraine, but Zelensky cancelled them. Of course, no elections are possible in Ukraine during the war because the constitution explicitly prohibits them, but propagandists are not interested in this. Putin in Telegram, a Russian propaganda channel, states that Zelensky is planning to organize another Maidan, a special operation to keep the power in his hands. The list goes on to say that Zelensky, Budanov and Yermak have planned an operation called Maidan 3, a staging of anti-government protests in Kiev. Of course, this is also another nonsense, but then another Russian propaganda resource, RIA Novosti, quoted Yan Gagin, a kind of advisor to the head of the so-called DPR, as saying to RIA Novosti, a military coup to overthrow Zelensky is not excluded in Ukraine, meaning that versions are changing like a kaleidoscope every minute in order to fill the information space with many different provocations, and then, depending on the situation, try to use one of the cards. Therefore, one should be very conscious when you see these propaganda narratives repeated, but from the minds of some representatives of the Ukrainian media sphere who do not hide their desire to serve and spread nonsense similar to Russian propaganda. The traditional call is to use critical thinking, not to trust Russian propaganda, and to be aware that Russian psyops often find continuation in media that mimic Ukrainian ones or are repeated of propaganda frameworks created in the headquarters of some Ukrainian politicians. With that, I urge you to be careful and trust the Ukrainian military and political leadership. See you soon.